Are you ready to question everything you thought you knew about how you make decisions? Buckle up, because in this deep dive, we're going to be exploring the origins of human intent.
Oh, yeah.
We're going deep.
Deeper.
Peeling back the layers of what we're calling the intention onion.
I like that.
We'll uncover the web of influences that shape our choices, from split-second impulses to the echoes of our evolutionary past.
It's amazing how much is going on beneath the surface when we make even the simplest decisions.
I know, right? And to guide us on this journey, we're diving into a fascinating chapter from a book that tackles the science of free will.
Oh, this is going to be good.
Trust me, you're in for some surprising insights.
Like what? Give me a teaser.
Okay, so get this. Did you know that just a whiff of something disgusting can make you more judgmental?
Really?
Yeah. Or that even something as random as your birth month can have a lasting impact on your life.
I'm intrigued already. Let's get this intention onion peeled.
Okay, let's start with those influences that happen just seconds before an intention is formed. You know those split-second decisions?
It's amazing how much our immediate environment, even things we're not consciously aware of, can nudge us towards a certain choice.
So you're talking about those subtle cues that we're picking up on all the time without even realizing it.
Exactly. Our senses are constantly feeding information to our brains, and that information can have some pretty interesting and unintended consequences on our thoughts and behaviors.
Like that study where people exposed to a bad smell were suddenly more likely to express negative biases towards certain groups.
Yeah, that one's a classic.
It's wild. You wouldn't think our sense of smell would have much to do with our moral judgments.
It seems counterintuitive, but there's a brain region called the insula that plays a role in processing both physical disgust, like a bad smell, and moral disgust, like witnessing unfair behavior.
So is the insula basically unable to tell the difference between a stinky trash can and a morally questionable act?
Well, it's not quite that simple, but it does seem that our brains draw connections between those two types of disgust.
Yeah.
Okay, so a bad smell might make you more likely to judge someone harshly, even if you're not consciously aware of why.
Exactly. Once that insula is activated, it can trigger a cascade of activity in other brain regions associated with things like fear and aggression, like the amygdala.
So you're saying I might be more likely to snap at someone just because I walked past a dumpster on my way to work?
It's not quite that straightforward. But the research does suggest that our sensory environments play a bigger role than we might realize. And it's not just bad smells either. There's research on how things like physical cleanliness can also influence our moral judgments.
Like the Macbeth effect they talked about in the book.
Yes, where feeling morally dirty makes people want to physically wash their hands.
It's like our brains are trying to cleanse themselves, both physically and morally.
It seems so. Our brains are constantly drawing these fascinating connections between physical and mental states.
Wow, okay, my mind is already blown. So we've explored those split-second influences. What about those factors that are working on our brains for hours, days, or even weeks before we form an intention?
We can't talk about influences on the brain without talking about hormones.
Oh, hormones, the secret puppet masters of our behavior.
Exactly. And there are a few key players here that have a powerful but often overlooked effect on our behavior. Testosterone, oxytocin, and stress hormones like glucocorticoids.
Ooh, hormones, always a recipe for some interesting behavior. Let's start with testosterone. Isn't that the one that makes people aggressive?
Well, it's not quite as simple as that. It's more accurate to say that testosterone amplifies pre-existing tendencies. It can make us more sensitive to social cues related to dominance and competition.
So if someone is already prone to aggression, testosterone might just turn up the volume on that behavior.
Precisely. And it's important to remember that testosterone levels fluctuate throughout the day, influenced by things like stress, competition, and even exercise.
That makes sense. Okay, what about oxytocin? That's the love hormone, right? Does that mean it just makes us feel all warm and fuzzy?
Oxytocin does promote pro-social behaviors like empathy, trust, and bonding. But there's a fascinating twist here.
What's the catch?
It seems that oxytocin primarily enhances these feelings towards people we consider part of our in-group, our tribe, so to speak.
Wait, hold on. I thought oxytocin was the love hormone. Are you saying it can actually make us more biased?
Well, it highlights this complex interplay between our biology and our social instincts. We evolved to cooperate and bond with our group and be wary of outsiders. Oxytocin seems to play a role in strengthening those bonds.
So it's like oxytocin is giving us a warm hug, but only if we're part of the right club.
You could say that. It's all about understanding the evolutionary context in which these hormones evolved.
Okay, so we've got testosterone potentially amping up aggression and oxytocin playing favorites in our social circles. What about stress hormones? I'm guessing those aren't going to have a positive effect on our decision making.
You're on the right track. When we're stressed, our bodies release glucocorticoids, and these hormones can have a significant impact on the brain.
In what way?
Well, they can make the amygdala, that fear and aggression center we talked about earlier, more reactive. And they can also impair the function of the prefrontal cortex, which is essential for things like impulse control and rational decision-making.
So basically, when we're stressed out, we're more likely to make impulsive, maybe even aggressive decisions because our brains aren't exactly functioning at their best.
That's a good summary. And what's even more intriguing is that the effects of stress hormones can vary significantly between individuals. Some people are more sensitive to them than others, and chronic stress can actually change the structure of the brain over time, making us more vulnerable to these effects.
So our past experiences with stress can actually change the physical structure of our brains, which in turn influences the decisions we make in the future.
You got it. It's a powerful example of how experience shapes the brain.
It's like our past is literally living within us, shaping our choices in ways we might not even realize.
That's a great way to put it. And it's not just about past experiences. Even things like what we eat and the bacteria living in our guts can influence brain function and behavior. It truly is a complex web of influences.
This is mind-blowing. It's like saying turtles all the way down, but with biology.
I love that analogy. And to really understand the full scope of these influences, we need to keep rewinding the clock. Let's go back to those formative years we all went through, adolescence.
Adolescence. That time of questionable fashion choices, intense emotions, and seemingly impulsive decisions. What's going on in the brain during those years?
Well, one of the most significant things is that the prefrontal cortex, that part of the brain we keep coming back to, which is crucial for impulse control and rational decision-making, is still under construction. It doesn't reach full maturity until well into adulthood.
So teenagers are basically running around with partially developed brains. That explains a lot.
It does. And this prolonged development of the prefrontal cortex isn't a design flaw. It's actually an evolutionary advantage. It allows this crucial brain region to be shaped by experience, by the demands of the social environment, and by the cultural norms of the time.
So all that teenage angst and experimentation actually serves a purpose. It's helping to sculpt the adult brain they'll eventually have.
Exactly. Those intense experiences of adolescence, the highs and lows, the social pressures, the challenges and triumphs, are all contributing to the wiring of the adult prefrontal cortex.
It's like those teenage years aren't just about surviving awkward phases. They're about building the very foundation for how they'll navigate the world as adults.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Now, speaking of foundations, we can't talk about the development of intent without acknowledging the immense influence of childhood.
Okay, let's rewind the clock even further to childhood. I'm guessing this is where things like parenting styles and social influences really come into play.
You got it. Childhood is a critical period for brain development, and the experiences we have during those early years can have a massive impact on shaping the adults we become.
I can see how parental warmth and support would be beneficial, but are you saying that even things like whether our neighborhood has safe parks can have a significant impact on our brains and behavior as adults?
It might sound surprising, but our early environment plays a huge role in shaping our neural pathways, our stress responses, and our overall well-being. It's a powerful example of how nature and nurture work together.
So it's not nature versus nurture. It's this intricate dance between our genes and our experiences, right?
Exactly. It's about understanding how those two forces are constantly interacting and influencing each other. And one way to visualize this is through a concept called the Adverse Childhood Experiences Score, or ACE score.
I've heard of that. It basically measures how much adversity a person experienced during childhood.
That's right. It takes into account things like abuse, neglect, and household dysfunction.
And I know there's a strong link between a high ACE score and all sorts of struggles in adulthood.
Exactly. It highlights the impact of factors that are completely outside of a child's control. Those children who experience high levels of adversity aren't choosing to struggle with these problems later in life. They're grappling with the consequences of a difficult past, often compounded by biological vulnerabilities that make them more sensitive to stress and trauma.
It really makes you think about how much choice is really involved when someone's intentions have been shaped by such difficult experiences.
It's a complex issue.
Yeah.
And it challenges our assumptions about personal responsibility. But it also underscores the importance of understanding the context of people's lives, the experiences that have shaped their brains and their behavior.
So instead of just judging someone's actions, we need to take a step back and ask, what happened to this person? What experiences might have led them to this point?
Exactly. That shift in perspective can lead to more compassionate and effective approaches to addressing these issues.
This whole conversation is making me reevaluate the whole concept of a level playing field. It seems like some people are starting the race with a significant advantage while others are facing hurdles right from the start.
That's a powerful insight.
Sure.
And to take it a step further, the book introduces this fascinating concept called the relative age effect.
The what effect?
The relative age effect. It refers to the fact that even something as seemingly random as your month of birth can have a lasting impact on your life outcomes.
Wait, you're telling me my birth month can influence my destiny? Now that sounds a bit like astrology.
I know it sounds strange, but the research is pretty compelling. Studies have shown that children who are older within their grade level, those born in January, for instance, versus those born in December, tend to do better academically and athletically and are even more likely to be selected for leadership positions.
Seriously. But why would that be? A few months difference shouldn't make such a big difference, right?
You'd think so. But those early advantages can snowball over time. Older children tend to be more physically and cognitively mature, which can give them an initial edge. And as they experience success, they gain confidence and motivation.
So it's like a self-perpetuating cycle.
Mhm.
Those who start out ahead tend to stay ahead, while those who start out behind have to work harder just to catch up.
That's the general idea. And what's fascinating is that this effect has been observed not just in academics and athletics, but in things like career success and even criminal behavior.
Wow, okay.
Yeah.
It's like even something as arbitrary as your birth month can give you a head start or set you back.
Exactly. It underscores the point that our lives are shaped by a web of influences, many of which are totally outside of our control.
Okay, my mind is officially blown. We've gone from split-second sensory influences to childhood experiences to the random luck of our birth month. Are we ready to go all the way back to the very beginning?
Let's do it. Let's journey back to where it all began, the womb.
Okay, I'm ready for a prenatal adventure. What's going on in that cozy environment that can shape our intentions later in life?
Believe it or not, even before we're born, our brains are already being sculpted by all sorts of influences. One of the most critical factors is the prenatal environment, particularly what's in the mother's bloodstream. Things like hormones, nutrients, and even exposure to stress or toxins.
So even before we take our first breath, our brains are already being shaped by factors that are totally beyond our control.
Precisely. And some of these prenatal influences can have a lasting impact. For example, high levels of stress hormones in the mother's bloodstream have been linked to a higher risk of anxiety and depression in her children later in life.
Wow, that's a powerful example of how interconnected we are. It's like we're carrying the echoes of our mother's experiences within us.
Exactly. And it's not just stress hormones. Exposure to certain androgens like testosterone in the womb has been linked to variations in aggression levels, and even things like nutrient deficiencies during pregnancy can impact brain development and mental health later on.
It's remarkable to think about how much is already being determined, for better or for worse, during that prenatal period. It's a reminder that we're all shaped by forces far beyond our conscious awareness right from the very start.
Absolutely.
Okay, so we've traced the roots of intent back to the womb, but we can't stop there, can we? There's one more layer to uncover.
You're right. We need to go even further back to the very blueprint that makes us who we are, our genes.
All right, let's talk genes. I know they play a role, but I'm guessing it's not as simple as just inheriting a gene for this or that behavior.
You're absolutely right. Genes aren't destiny. It's more about how those genes are expressed throughout our lives and how they interact with the unique environment we encounter.
So it's this constant interplay between our genetic inheritance and our lived experiences.
Exactly. And it's a dynamic dance, not a static one. Our genes can be switched on or off, amplified or dampened based on all sorts of environmental factors, from the food we eat to the social interactions we have. It's a field called epigenetics.
So even though we inherit our genes, our experiences can actually influence how those genes are expressed.
That's a great way to put it. We're not just passive recipients of our genetic inheritance, we're active participants in this ongoing interplay between nature and nurture.
Can you give me an example of how this works in real life?
Sure. Let's say someone inherits a gene variant that's associated with a greater sensitivity to stress. Now, depending on the environment, that gene variant could play out in very different ways.
Okay, I'm listening.
If they grow up in a supportive and nurturing environment, they might develop healthy coping mechanisms and thrive. But if they experience chronic stress or trauma, that same gene variant might make them more vulnerable to anxiety or depression later on.
So the same gene can lead to very different outcomes depending on a person's experiences.
Exactly. It all comes down to this complex interaction between genes and environment. And to Add another layer of complexity. Most genes come in multiple variations called variants, and each variant can have slightly different effects.
So there's this incredible diversity of genetic blueprints out there, all interacting with unique environments.
That's right. To give you a sense of the sheer scale of individuality, humans have variability in roughly 4 million spots in the DNA sequence that codes for genes active in the brain.
4 million. That's mind-boggling. It really highlights how incredibly unique each of us is.
And it's this complexity that makes us so fascinating, so unpredictable, and so uniquely human.
Okay, we've traveled from the milliseconds before a decision to the depths of our DNA. It's clear that our intentions emerge from this incredible symphony of influences, a symphony that began long before we were even born. But with so many forces at play, where does this leave our sense of free will?
That's the million-dollar question.
Yeah.
And it's one that we'll explore in more depth in our next segment.
Okay, I'm ready to tackle that philosophical elephant in the room.
Let's do it.
So we've explored how everything from hormones to genes can shape our intentions. But now we're zooming out to consider the influence of culture.
It's fascinating how much our culture shapes our thoughts and actions without us even realizing it.
Yeah, it's such a huge topic, though. Like, how does culture actually shape those everyday decisions we make?
You can think of culture almost like an invisible framework that shapes how we see the world, how we interpret information, and how we make choices.
So it's deeper than just following customs or traditions.
Exactly. It provides us with a set of values, beliefs, and practices that guide our behavior. It influences our understanding of what's right and wrong, what's appropriate and what's not.
And are these cultural influences just things we learn, or are they somehow wired into our brains?
That's the amazing part. They become woven into the very fabric of our brains, influencing our thoughts, feelings, and actions on a really deep, often unconscious level.
Okay, so it's not just about following the rules, it's about this deeper level of influence that shapes how we interact with the world.
Precisely. And the book talks about how these cultural differences play out in fascinating ways across the globe. A classic example is the contrast between individualistic and collectivistic cultures.
Right, like how here in the US, we tend to value individual achievement and autonomy.
Exactly. And in many collectivist cultures, like those found in East Asia, the emphasis is more on harmony, interdependence, and putting the needs of the group first.
I remember reading about that. But how do those abstract cultural values actually translate into real-world differences in behavior? Like, does it actually impact how people make decisions?
Absolutely. It affects everything from the way people communicate and express their emotions to how they approach problem solving and decision making.
Can you give me an example?
Sure. Take how people describe themselves. In individualistic cultures, people tend to focus on their unique traits and accomplishments. They might say, I'm a lawyer, or I graduated top of my class. But in collectivist cultures, identity is more tied to relationships and roles within the family or community. Someone might say, I'm the eldest son, or I'm part of a team working on this project.
So even the way we talk about ourselves reflects these deeper cultural values.
Exactly. And it goes even deeper than that. Research has shown that people from different cultures actually process information differently. Their brains show distinct patterns of activity when performing certain tasks.
Wait a minute. Are you saying that our brains are literally wired differently depending on the culture we grow up in?
That's what the research suggests. It's pretty remarkable. And what's even more interesting is that these differences in brain wiring aren't just random. They reflect adaptations to specific environmental and historical circumstances that have shaped those societies over generations.
So culture isn't just this random set of rules. It's like this living, evolving system that's shaped by a society's history and the environment.
That's a great way to put it. It's like a toolbox that's been passed down through generations with all these strategies for navigating the world and solving problems that are specific to that society's circumstances.
Okay, so we've got this idea of culture as a kind of shared mental operating system shaped by history and environment. Are there any specific examples of how these cultural adaptations play out in the way people make decisions?
There are some really fascinating examples in the book. One that comes to mind is the idea that even the type of agriculture a society relied on, rice versus wheat, might have influenced the development of these individualistic versus collectivist cultures.
Hold on, what does farming have to do with individualism or collectivism?
It has to do with the demands of each type of agriculture. Rice farming, which was prevalent in much of East Asia, requires a high degree of cooperation and coordination. It literally takes a village to build and maintain those intricate irrigation systems and to plant and harvest the crops together. So over generations, those societies developed cultural norms that emphasize interdependence and putting the needs of the group above individual desires.
So the very act of working together to grow rice might have shaped those collectivist values.
Exactly. And in contrast, wheat farming, which was common in many Western societies, is more of an individualistic endeavor. Farmers could work their own land relatively independently, relying less on their neighbors for success.
So that independence might have fostered more of a focus on individual initiative and self-reliance.
That's the idea. It's a great example of how our environment can shape our cultural values and ultimately how our brains work.
Okay, but are there other examples beyond farming of how geography and history have influenced these different cultural norms and our intentions?
Oh, definitely.
Yeah.
The book mentions some fascinating comparisons. For example, there's research suggesting that living in a dense rainforest versus a sparse desert might have influenced the development of religious beliefs and rituals.
Really? It makes you wonder how our spiritual practices might have evolved if our ancestors had faced different environmental challenges.
Exactly. And the book also explores this concept of cultures of honor.
Cultures of honor, what are those?
There are societies that place a really high value on reputation and social status, where even a perceived insult or slight can trigger a strong, sometimes even aggressive response.
Wow. So in these cultures, there's this intense pressure to protect one's honor and reputation.
Right. And these cultures often emerge in environments where resources are scarce or where there's a history of lawlessness or instability.
So in a way, it becomes a survival strategy to be seen as tough and willing to fight back.
Precisely. And the interesting thing is that once these cultural norms become established, they can persist for generations, shaping people's behavior long after the original conditions that led to them have changed.
It's fascinating how culture can create these self-perpetuating cycles. Certain behaviors get rewarded, others get punished, and over time, those values become deeply ingrained.
It's this complex interplay between individual psychology, social dynamics, and history, all weaving together to shape the cultural landscape. And to further explore this, the book introduces this distinction between tight and loose cultures.
Tight versus loose? I haven't heard of that one. What's the difference?
It's about how strictly a society enforces social norms. Tight cultures have lots of rules, both explicit and implicit, and there's a lot of pressure to conform. People who break the rules, even in small ways, are likely to face disapproval or even punishment. Think of the societies that put a strong emphasis on tradition and order.
So in a tight culture, there's not much room for individuality or deviating from the norm. It's exactly. In contrast, loose cultures are more permissive. They're more tolerant of individual expression. And there's more flexibility in how people are expected to behave. They tend to be more open to change and innovation.
I can see how those cultural differences might influence how people make decisions. Are there any theories about what causes a society to become tight or loose?
Researchers believe it's a combination of factors. One is the presence of threats. Like if a society has historically faced a lot of natural disasters or if resources are really scarce, they often develop tighter norms to ensure cooperation and survival. It's like a collective response to shared vulnerability.
That makes sense. If you're constantly facing threats, you need everyone to be on the same page and following the rules.
Right. And historical experiences also play a role. Societies that have been through a lot of upheaval, like wars or invasions, often develop tighter norms as a way to maintain order and stability.
It's like a way of creating a sense of unity and shared purpose during times of uncertainty.
Exactly. And there's even some evidence that population density can influence cultural tightness. Really? So you're saying that living in a densely populated area might make a society more likely to have strict social norms?
That's what some researchers believe. In crowded environments where people are constantly interacting, there's more of a need for shared rules and coordination to prevent conflict and chaos.
It's like an unspoken agreement to follow the rules so everyone can coexist peacefully.
Exactly. And to really drive this point home, the book highlights a study that found a link between a country's population density in the year 1500 and its current level of cultural tightness.
Wait, the year 1500? You mean cultural patterns from over 500 years ago are still influencing how societies function today?
That's what the research suggests. It really highlights the enduring legacy of cultural influences.
This is making me rethink my whole understanding of culture. It's not just about traditions or customs. It's this really deep-seated set of values and practices shaped by history, the environment, and even things like population density.
And recognizing this cultural dimension is so important when we're trying to understand where our intentions come from. Because our intentions aren't formed in isolation. They're shaped by these shared values and beliefs of the culture we're part of.
So to really understand our own intentions, we need to consider this vast cultural landscape, these invisible forces that are shaping us from the inside out.
Precisely. And speaking of zooming out, let's not forget about evolution. We're the products of millions of years of evolutionary history, and that history has shaped not only our biology, but also our capacity for culture itself.
Okay, so let's go back in time and explore those evolutionary roots. How does our evolutionary heritage fit into this whole conversation about intentions?
The most fundamental point is that our capacity for intentionality, our ability to form goals and make plans, is itself a product of evolution. We're here because our ancestors survived and reproduced, passing down their genes and their behavioral tendencies to us.
So in a way, we're carrying the legacy of our evolutionary past in our DNA.
Exactly. For example, humans evolved to be intensely social creatures, and that social nature is deeply ingrained in our brains and behavior. We've got this innate drive to cooperate, to form bonds with each other, and to be really sensitive to social cues and norms.
So that need to belong and connect with others, that's not just a modern day thing. It's wired into us from millions of years of evolution.
That's right. And those social instincts are still shaping our intentions even in today's complex world.
Yeah.
We're constantly seeking approval, trying to avoid conflict, and making decisions that will boost our social standing, often without even realizing it.
It's amazing to think about how something as ancient as our evolutionary past is still influencing us today. But if our intentions are so shaped by these deep-seated evolutionary drives, does that mean we don't really have free will? Are we just puppets on a string?
That's a question that sparked a lot of debate. It's important to remember that evolution doesn't dictate our every move. We still have this incredible capacity for learning adaptation and conscious decision-making, but those abilities are built on a foundation that was laid down over millions of years of evolution.
So evolution provided the building blocks, and our experiences and culture shape how those blocks are assembled.
Precisely. It's this interplay between nature and nurture that makes us so complex and so adaptable.
Okay, so we've journeyed from the milliseconds before decision to the depths of our DNA and the vast expanse of cultural history. And it's becoming clear that our intentions emerge from this incredible symphony of influences, a symphony that stretches way back in time. But if all these factors are shaping our intentions, where does that leave our sense of free will? Are we really in control of our choices, or are we just playing out a script that's already been written?
That's the big question, isn't it? And it's one that we'll explore in more depth in our next segment, because trying to understand where intention comes from ultimately leads us to confront one of the most fundamental philosophical questions of all. What's it really mean to be free?
Okay, I'm ready to tackle that philosophical elephant in the room.
Let's dive in.
Okay, so we've explored all these factors that shape our intentions, from our biology and genes to our environment and culture. It's clear that a lot is going on behind the scenes when we make decisions, but now we're at the heart of the matter. Does free will even exist, or is it all just an illusion?
It's a question that philosophers have been wrestling with for centuries. And as we've seen, science keeps revealing more and more layers of complexity when it comes to how our brains work, how our genes interact with our environment, how our past shapes our present. All of this makes it pretty tough to argue for this idea of a completely free will, a will that's totally independent of all those influences.
Yeah, I have to admit, after everything we've discussed, I'm starting to question the whole idea of free will. It's like, if all these factors are at play, how much agency do we really have?
Right, and some philosophers take this idea all the way. They're called determinists, and they basically say free will just doesn't exist in a universe where everything is governed by cause and effect.
Determinists. So they're saying it's like a chain reaction. Every thought and action is just an inevitable consequence of what came before, stretching all the way back to the beginning of time.
Exactly. They argue that there's no room for genuine freedom in a world where everything is predetermined.
Okay, that's a pretty bleak outlook. It's like we're all just puppets dancing on the strings of fate with no real choice in the matter.
I get it. It can feel a bit disempowering. But luckily, there are other philosophical perspectives that try to reconcile the idea of free will with this deterministic view of the universe.
Oh, really? So there are philosophers who think we can have both free will and live in a world of cause and effect.
Yes, one approach is called compatibilism. And it argues that free will and determinism are actually mutually exclusive.
Compatibilism. So how do they square that circle? How do they make those two ideas work together?
When it all comes down to how compatibilists define free will, they don't see it as some magical ability to act independently of all previous causes. It's not about breaking free from the laws of physics or anything like that.
So what is it about then?
For compatibilists, free will is about having the ability to act in accordance with our desires and beliefs. even if those desires and beliefs are themselves shaped by all those factors we've been talking about.
So even if our wants and desires are influenced by our genes, our environment, our past experiences, and all that, we can still be considered free as long as we're acting on those wants.
Exactly. It's not about having ultimate control over where those desires come from. It's about having the capacity to act on them once they're there. It's about being able to pursue our goals and make choices that align with our values.
I see. So it's less about choosing what we want and more about being able to act on those wants, however they came about.
That's a good way to put it. And this distinction becomes particularly important when we start talking about moral responsibility.
Right, because if all of our choices are ultimately shaped by forces beyond our control, can we really be held accountable for them? Does this mean we get a free pass for our bad decisions?
It's a tough question. And the book doesn't give us any easy answers. But it does suggest that recognizing the complexity of all these influences can lead us to a more nuanced and compassionate approach to morality and justice.
So it's not just about punishing people for breaking the rules, but understanding the factors that might have led them to that point.
Right. It's about taking into account the context of the individual's history and circumstances.
It's almost like shifting from blaming people for their actions to trying to understand how they got to that point.
Exactly. And this understanding can have big implications for how we approach things like rehabilitation and social justice. Instead of just focusing on punishment, we might start to think more about addressing the underlying issues that contribute to crime, providing people with support and resources, helping them to make better choices.
It's a more holistic approach that recognizes the complexity of human behavior.
Exactly.
This whole conversation has really been an eye-opener. It's made me question so many things about how I view the world and make decisions.
Me too. And I think that's the point. These aren't easy questions, but they're worth wrestling with. They force us to think critically about who we are, how we make choices, and what it means to live a good life.
Well said. And on that note, I think it's time to wrap up this deep dive. We've explored a lot of complex territory today. But if there's one thing I hope our listeners take away, it's this. Our intentions are shaped by a vast and intricate web of influences.
That's right. From our biology and genes to our environment and culture to the very evolutionary history of our species.
So those everyday choices we make, those moments when we feel like we're acting freely, are actually the culmination of a long and fascinating story. And that story continues to unfold with every decision we make.
It really makes you appreciate the complexity of the human experience.
It does. And it also makes you realize that even though we might not have complete control over all the factors that shape our intentions, we still have the power to choose, to learn to grow, to strive to be better versions of ourselves.
Absolutely. And that's a powerful reminder that even in a world of infinite influences, our choices still matter.
Well said. And to our listeners, thank you for joining us on this journey into the heart of human intent. Keep questioning